Today we have another meeting as part of the Future Builders project. I'm Paweł Gregorczyk and I'll be speaking with my guest, architect Agnieszka Kalinowska-Sołtys. But before we dive in, let me share a few words about the Future Builders project. The aim of the initiative is to create a unique platform for dialogue on the future of design, architecture, urban planning and construction. The Future Builders project is developed and sponsored by Aluprof. Today, we are pleased to welcome Agnieszka Kalinowska-Sołtys to the studio. She's an architect, partner and board member of APA Wojciechowski Architekci. From 2022 to 2024, she served as the president of the Association of Polish Architects. She's a graduate of the Faculty of Architecture at the Warsaw University of Technology and Real Estate Management at the Warsaw University of Life Sciences. She has been involved in numerous award-winning public utility projects, is a co-founder of the National Association for the Support of Sustainable Construction, a member of the Program Council of the United Nations Global Compact Network Poland, and a key partner of the SDG 11 Steering Committee. Additionally, a member of the Green Building Standard Verification and Certification Commission. Good morning, Agnieszka. Welcome to our studio. Good morning, Paweł. Let's start with an unconventional question. Very bad, not bad, or very good? How would you rate the state of sustainable construction in our country? That's a very good and interesting question. I'll answer from the perspective of architects, as well as from the viewpoint of building materials and technology manufacturers. So, it's quite a mixed response. I often hear reactions like, sustainability? Why do we need that? We design buildings that are beautiful, durable, aesthetically pleasing and functional. Why should we make our job as architects even more challenging? We already have a complex puzzle to solve with regulations, development conditions, and numerous aspects that need to come together to create truly great buildings. We also have to consider how these buildings fit into the urban landscape. So why should we add sustainability to the mix, dealing with building materials that aren't immediately visible? We are limiting our creativity in some ways. We have to approach building installations differently, which isn't always visible in the final product. So why make things more difficult? And I hear similar sentiments from manufacturers of technology and materials. For them, it's business as usual. They have proven technologies that are profitable, reliable, and well regarded. There are no complaints. These materials are durable and aesthetically pleasing. Why change anything? Yet, there are numerous facts to consider. Facts that I find quite compelling. Look at what's happening to our planet. Over the past 200 years, since the Industrial Revolution around 1800, we've been extracting and burning coal, oil and gas on a massive scale. In the past 200 years, we've increased the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere by over 150%. This has disrupted a natural balance that had remained relatively stable throughout human history. As a result, we've also altered the physical processes of our planet. We're heating up because the energy balance on our planet, where the amount of energy coming in was once equal to the amount going out, has been disrupted due to extracting and burning fossil fuels on a large scale. Additionally, looking back 200 years, there were about 1 billion people. 50 years ago, that number had grown to 4 billion. And in the last 50 years, we've doubled the global population. Today, we have 8 billion people. Everyone wants to live and work somewhere. Everyone wants a comfortable life. Everyone contributes to CO2 emissions, right? Correct. This can be measured on a per capita basis. The question then becomes, what's next? We need to consider various data points, such as the total number of living beings on the planet, including people and animals. We must act locally, but think globally. If we consider all living beings on our planet, it turns out more than 36% are humans. This means that around 1/3 is made up of the 8 billion people living here today, and in 30 years there could be 10 billion. That might not sound so alarming yet. For me, the frightening fact is that 60% of this total is livestock, which is the food we rely on. About 3.5 to 4% is comprised of wild creatures, and this is increasing. Returning to the topic of buildings and urban development, UN reports show that humans have already transformed 75% of the land globally in a way that is complete and irreversible. We have urbanized much of it. Of course, cities themselves account for only 3 to 4% of the land, but this figure doesn't include the infrastructure, mining, and environmental degradation associated with urbanization. Additionally, we often overlook the degradation of the oceans and seas. These bodies of water are crucial. They act as the lungs of our planet, providing clean air and producing oxygen. Clearly, something very troubling has happened to our planet in the last 50 years. In fact, we knew about these issues even 50 years ago. In the 1970s, early simulations and mathematical models predicted how humanity would develop, how our growth would unfold, and how our carbon and environmental footprints would change. And it turns out that now, 50 years later, those mathematical calculations have proven to be accurate about 98% of the time. We already knew back then that if we wouldn't make changes, things would turn out badly. Have we made those changes? The trials are ongoing. As far back as 1987, with the Montreal Protocol, humanity recognized a serious problem. The gases we were emitting were depleting the ozone layer. This depletion allowed a greater amount of UV rays to reach the Earth, posing a significant threat to our health and life. If action wasn't taken, it would have led to a disaster, widespread illness and environmental devastation. Fortunately, we did take action. The Montreal Protocol gradually mandated the phase-out of gases that deplete the ozone layer. As a result, the so-called ozone hole is beginning to close. This shows that we have managed to address and fix a significant environmental issue. Then, in 1992, with the Kyoto Protocol, there was further realization that burning too much fossil fuel, coal, oil, was leading to excessive emissions and global warming. This marked a significant step in addressing the issue of climate change. However, it wasn't until 2016, with the Paris Agreement, that 171 countries acknowledged that the situation was no longer just a theory, but a serious reality. Glaciers are melting, contributing to the warming of ocean waters, which in turn is slowing down ocean currents. This leads to reduced oxygenation in certain areas and impairs the function of the oceans, which act as the planet's lungs. Meanwhile, climate change on land has become increasingly pronounced. What's happening in the atmosphere is also alarming. We've begun to conduct more simulations that indicate it's no longer just a matter of whether we can stop or slow down climate change, but rather how we will adapt to it. We are certainly trying to slow it down. This effort is crucial for our survival as a species on this planet. These scenarios are challenging. Over the last 50 years, sea levels have risen by about 20 centimeters. This has already led to flooding in certain cities and has forced some countries to relocate because their islands are being inundated. These are real problems occurring right now. For example, when designing designing ports, even in Poland, we must consider how the Baltic Sea's water levels will rise over the next 50 years. We need to assess which areas will be at risk of flooding and how we can protect certain areas from such events. This consideration extends beyond individual buildings to encompass entire cities and urban planning. This sounds like a pessimistic but real vision of our future. It's not a vision, it's reality. Yes, especially since our assumptions about what it might look like are always being proven right. You mentioned that 90+% of the predictions made decades ago have proven accurate. The situation with sustainable construction in Poland is definitely concerning. I don't think the situation is average, it seems rather poor based on what you're saying. We also need to be aware that the construction industry, the process of building and then using those buildings, is responsible for what is estimated in Europe. 38% of emissions are related to building construction and use, and 35 to 36% of energy consumption is associated with buildings. We need to recognize that we are working in an industry that has a negative impact on our planet, our future, and the well-being of future generations. So we are discussing the current state of affairs. When it comes to the industry, awareness is key. I have the impression that we're still having internal discussions among experts about what's happening and how things stand. It's surprising that some architects continue to question climate change, failing to see the real visible impacts happening outside their windows, as if things have always been this way. Of course, the Earth has experienced warmer periods in the past, like when it was 4 degrees warmer and there were no humans. There were also colder periods with global glaciation. However, things never changed as rapidly as they do now. Today, climate changes driven by human activity occur within a decade or even less. In contrast, historical climate changes happened over thousands of years, allowing time for plants and animals to migrate and adapt. It is now referred to as the 6th mass extinction event, meaning that the 3.5% of wild species remaining are highly endangered. Almost every month, a species goes extinct irreversibly because it cannot adapt to climate change. As humans, we have intelligence, buildings, cities, and technology that can help us survive and address these changes. I think the key question now is how we should approach the construction of the future, which we are essentially designing today. These buildings will be erected in 2, 3, or 4 years and hopefully used for decades beyond that. We need to focus on how to build structures and cities that are not only safe and functional, but also minimize further harm. We should seek our technologies and solutions that address and repair the damage we have already caused. We also need to recognize that emissions related to the construction and use of buildings must be reduced to zero. That's why the European Commission aims for climate neutrality by 2050. So how do we design buildings to be truly green, and what should this look like from an architect's perspective? We need to identify where the biggest challenges lie. On the one hand, we need to quantify and understand the impact so we can improve and make changes. To do this, we must measure the environmental footprint. A crucial component of this footprint is the carbon footprint. We can measure the carbon footprint of buildings, including the emissions associated with their construction and the production of building materials. This is known as the embedded carbon footprint. By comparing different materials, we can assess their carbon footprints and choose those with a lower impact. This comparison should be made in the context of the entire life cycle. If a building material has a low carbon footprint but poor durability and quality, it may not be a viable choice. We need to consider the material's performance over 60, 80 years, or even longer. We assume that this is the expected lifespan of the building, which is a key consideration in its life cycle. This presents a significant challenge for manufacturers of building materials and technologies. Fortunately, we live at a time when these technologies are evolving rapidly, which can be seen as a fortunate development. There are plenty of innovations available, so why not utilize them? In fact, we must start using them now. We need to change our thinking. The second, and often more challenging aspect of buildings is the environmental footprint associated with their use. While we measure the carbon footprint because it's the most tangible and currently the most damaging, the environmental footprint encompasses a broader range of factors. Energy consumption is a key component of this broader footprint. Energy consumption, particularly in Poland, is a major concern. Most of our electricity is generated from coal and gas, with around 75% of it coming from these sources. This reliance on fossil fuels makes our use of electricity highly detrimental to the environment. We need to transition to renewable energy sources as soon as possible. This means harnessing energy from the sun, wind, and geothermal sources for our buildings. Poland has favorable climate conditions to support this shift and increase the percentage of renewable energy in our energy mix. In comparison, Switzerland relies on non-renewable energy sources for only 7 to 8% of its energy needs, primarily natural gas, which is much less harmful when burned than coal. Compared to other European countries, our country has a very high level of environmental harm from energy consumption. Therefore, we need to address not only electricity, but also the heating and cooling of buildings. First and foremost, we need to focus on reducing energy consumption, ensuring that buildings use as little energy as possible. After that, we should transition to renewable energy sources. As we power these buildings, we should design them to utilize renewable energy sources such as solar, wind, and geothermal as much as possible on site. This approach helps minimize reliance on dirty energy. While focusing on the carbon footprint is crucial, there are many other factors to consider as well. I think there will be time for those details later, but I'm also curious what drives the development in construction. Are architects like you pushing for the creation of new, environmentally friendly materials through your designs? Or is it more often the material manufacturers who introduce what they call eco-friendly options and then push for their use? How does this dynamic work? I would also perversely ask about the role of the investor. How does the investor fit into this? They want a building with a long life cycle and view it as a business investment. They need the building to be completed in the here and now. There is a construction project preparation phase. The investor has a budget, but a commercial investor who views the building as a business also considers the long-term perspective. They want the building to be profitable for 60 years, generating rental income and returns. It's a well-known fact that money drives decisions. Regardless of our discussions about ecology and nature, the reality is that business and immediate concerns often take precedence. Sustainability is still emerging as a critical factor, and for some, it can be seen as an additional challenge or inconvenience, an invention of some sort. Yes, so to return to the question of influence, whether it's architects, contractors, or developers, the key is that everyone needs to design wisely and adopt sustainable practices as soon as possible. Of course, it has to make financial sense, otherwise no one will choose sustainable development purely for ideological reasons, especially if it's very costly. Architects, at the start of the investment process, are expected to provide not only a blueprint for how the building should be constructed and look, but also a plan for how it will function throughout its life cycle. If a building is to function for 50 or 100 years, we have to predict its life cycle. We know that the structure should survive this entire life cycle. But what about the installations, for example? That's 15 to 25 years, meaning we'll need to replace installations several times over the building's life cycle and perform major overhauls. This creates additional environmental impacts due to disposal, new purchases, manufacturing, and importing. The same applies to interior finishes. 10 years, 5 years, even shorter for hotels, leading to frequent transportation, installation and disposal. This process, which is not eco-friendly, adds to the environmental footprint, including the burning of oil and fuels for transportation. The more exotic materials imported from afar, the larger the footprint, after all. Absolutely. When considering building materials and their life cycle, it's crucial to factor in their origins and transportation impact. Why should we import stone from Asia just because we like how it looks on the facade and has a nice price? We need to consider that it's mined in places like China, where child labor might be involved, young people die, and the environment is severely degraded. Often, the mining sites are not even reclaimed. Also, the exotic wood cut from the forests in Brazil, the Amazon, where no one replants, or worse, where they plant avocados that grow for 2 years, exhaust the land, and leave it a desert where nothing will grow again. These aspects are crucial when thinking about building materials. We need to consider these environmental impacts in our decisions. So, it's about the entire supply chain. When choosing building materials, architects, manufacturers, and investors need to take responsibility. Ethical aspects should be a key consideration in these decisions. Responsibility extends beyond just environmental impact to include social costs as well. This is where ESG, environment, social governance, comes into play. It's about the entire philosophy that considers not only environmental concerns, but also social aspects and the overall management of these factors. Corporate responsibility is crucial. Many businesses have a significant environmental impact. While we discuss the carbon and environmental footprint of buildings, we must also recognize that every business, including ours, has its own footprint. The carbon and environmental footprints we create have a significant impact, so it's important to consider how we can also save the environment. It turns out that with thoughtful planning, we can also save money. You mentioned that a lot of responsibility is needed here. And the question is, do you see this responsibility growing among us in Poland? Are we becoming more conscious and adopting green building practices, or are we still lagging behind in this area? Fortunately, as part of the European Union, we have a framework guiding us. The European Commission has been focused on these issues since 2016, aiming for climate neutrality by 2050. This means not only stopping harmful emissions, but also addressing and repairing the damage we've already done. So, the directives and regulations from the European Union are valuable tools that help guide us through this transition. However, Poland is unfortunately lagging behind for various reasons. Political turmoil and a lack of education and awareness contribute to Poland's lagging position. Among experts, there's a clear understanding of the situation. We follow reports, watch NASA simulations, and see what's coming. We know that if we don't change our business practices now, as global companies and corporations are aware, we risk going out of business in the near future. So, returning to architects and building materials manufacturers, whether they want to or not, sticking to business as usual will soon become unsustainable. We can no longer afford to think that waste and environmental damage simply disappear from sight. We must take on both social and ethical responsibility for our actions. So, what materials should we focus on? Aluminum, for example, is a good choice because it can be recycled multiple times. A window made of aluminum today can potentially be recycled into a new window in 100 years.
Czy właśnie aluminium też jest takim materiałem i co jeszcze w takim razie?
However, it's important to note that the initial production of aluminum has a significant carbon footprint. Fortunately, materials like aluminum, glass, and steel can be recycled and reused many times, which helps offset the initial environmental impact. In fact, steel used in construction, particularly for reinforcement, is often 90 to 100% recycled. When we dismantle buildings, whether they are 50 or 20 years old, we recover almost all the steel. We crush the reinforced concrete, which could have lasted 100 to 200 years. But anyway, technologies exist to crush and reuse concrete, albeit often for different applications. So in addition to recycling materials, like steel and concrete, we should focus on reducing transportation distances to minimize environmental impact. We shouldn't import from China or India. For example, when building in Australia, we shouldn't import wood from Europe, even though wood has a lower carbon footprint compared to reinforced concrete. Instead, we should build smartly. For instance, in Poland, we should consider using wood because we have a nearby supply in Europe. As we know, a growing tree absorbs carbon dioxide and stores it as carbon compounds. As long as the wood is not burned or allowed to rot, and the gases don't return to the atmosphere, we maintain this carbon storage. Concrete technology has advanced significantly over the past 20-30 years, and while the carbon footprint of cement is now lower due to innovations, it remains quite high. Concrete is a remarkable material, durable, safe, and resistant to corrosion, but it should be used wisely, just like aluminum. Just going back to aluminum, let's use it wisely. As we dismantle a building, we should carefully extract and respect the materials we recover. And let's respect the materials, yes? If we must demolish a building for various reasons, we shouldn't treat it as waste to be discarded in a landfill. Instead, we should view it as a source of valuable secondary materials. I understand it might not be economically profitable right away, but ecologically, we need to approach it this way. But environmentally, we need to approach it this way. Not everything is immediately financially rewarding. That is to say, there should be financial incentives to make it profitable for us. I'm directing it to those in power. We need to ensure that we extract value from waste respectfully and efficiently. As I understand it, profitability is crucial for mobilization, correct? Yes, especially considering that primary resources like gas and oil are also finite. Hence, we are moving towards electromobility. The question is whether this is the right direction. That's probably a discussion for another time, given that Europe lacks rare earth elements, which we must import from distant locations. But once these elements are in the batteries, what happens to them next? Is there a possibility of recovering them later? Why not explore it? Currently, the technology isn't advanced enough to guarantee recovery, but we should consider that today's buildings will serve as sources of secondary materials in the future. So we should design buildings with recyclable materials. There's much to discuss about materials, including water usage. In material production, not only is energy consumed, but also significant amounts of water.
materiałów nie tylko się zużywa energię, ale też olbrzymie ilości wody.
Concrete is just
Beton to
such an example where a significant amount of water is used. Yes, if we take a moment to discuss water, it's closely related to building operations. We need drinking water for the building, and the building then produces wastewater, which must be treated. This process involves pumping and using chemicals, contributing to a non-environmental impact as it requires energy and resources. Treating and recycling this water to make it suitable for reuse or returning it to the tap as drinking water also adds to the carbon footprint. And the same applies to manufacturing. Even large amounts of water are used. So the footprint, which can be converted to a carbon footprint, provides information on how harmful materials like aluminum, glass or concrete are to the environment. Choosing technologies that have a lower environmental impact during production is already a step in the right direction, as it helps reduce the built-in carbon footprint. However, the entire life cycle remains crucial. You sit on the SARP competition judging panel, so you have access to and see many different types of projects. Is there a trend in these new developments where we are seeing a surge in eco-solutions, or is this still just a small fraction of what is currently being designed? The trend is there, but it is still a small fraction of what is being designed. Energy conservation in Poland is crucial, as it translates into significant building operating costs. There's a strong focus on energy efficiency in buildings, and this is evident in competitions and designs, with an emphasis on passive solutions such as harnessing solar energy and optimizing building orientation to take advantage of natural conditions and renewable energy sources. Energy efficiency is often a primary concern in architectural designs, as it leads to lower operational costs, which in turn makes the building less harmful for the environment. This shift is encouraging, as just 10-15 years ago, the focus was mainly on the initial construction cost. Now, there's a growing awareness of the long-term operational costs, though in housing, there is still a predominant focus on initial construction and resale value. So, what if there are problems later in the life cycle, once we sell to these 100 investors or private families? It doesn't matter because it's not our business anymore. However, investors are increasingly becoming aware and are gradually seeking solutions that are more beneficial to them. It depends on how we view the building. For commercial and private buildings, which are essentially businesses, the goal is for the building to generate revenue. It needs to be high quality, durable, and comfortable to use. Take office spaces, for example. The goal is for the building to support efficient work. Companies renting office space want to attract tenants by offering a high-quality, comfortable, and well-located environment. They also want a space that's healthy. A healthy and satisfied employee is more likely to be productive and come to work regularly. This benefits the employer, who is more likely to be satisfied with the space and continue renting it. So it's important to consider the health and well-being of the building's users. Architecture should create spaces where people feel good, good acoustics, pleasant lighting, and more. We also need to consider less visible factors that impact health. For example, there's something called sick building syndrome. For example, we might feel fine in the morning, but after spending a few hours in the building, we might start feeling unwell. You may notice symptoms like aching bones or joints and think you're coming down with something. However, once you leave the building, you start feeling better within an hour or two. It's not that you have a viral or a bacterial infection. It could be that the quality of the interior environment is so poor. Issues like volatile organic compounds, mold, and fungi can be the culprits. This is not a question of a mythical water vein, right? It might be a factor, but I think it's a minor one. There are also concerns about magnetic radiation, but the main focus is on the quality of the internal environment. What we can't see, we can't feel, but it poisons us. A lack of oxygen due to insufficient ventilation. This often prompts us to go outside, change the environment, and feel better. However, this brings us to a major issue. 99% of buildings are the existing ones, and 30% of these in Poland have a sick building syndrome. This problem affects not only the buildings where we work, but also those where we live. We face the challenge of addressing existing buildings through comprehensive renovations, including facade replacement and upgrading installations. We must also consider the materials used, whether paints, varnishes and adhesives emit formaldehydes, volatile organic compounds and other harmful substances that go unnoticed. I wanted to ask about this because it's difficult to discuss green building without also addressing broader issues like carbon footprint, emissions, and the materials used in construction. But specifically, if we have a building and the architect is wondering what design solutions to use to make it greener, what are the simplest steps to take to get started?
No, jakie to są właśnie te rozwiązania takie najprostsze, żebyśmy zrobili ten pierwszy krok przynajmniej?
I may start because you mentioned green building at the very beginning. Are there such buildings at all? I don't know of any in Poland, honestly, because for me, ecology means something environmentally friendly that does no harm. At the outset, we said the buildings cause a lot of damage. Is sustainable a better word at this point? Well, that's right, but sustainable means that we should offset this negative impact by making improvements. That is, we balance it out. Sustainable is a somewhat different term. There isn't a direct translation for this, but it involves some form of balance. I don't know of such buildings in Poland either, as calculating the carbon footprint often turns out to be very high. Even with a wooden structure, assuming the wood is growing, the tree absorbs carbon dioxide from the environment, so it might even start with a negative footprint. However, the building still needs to be lit, heated and used. So for me, there are no green buildings in Poland, and I should also mention the European Commission's regulation, which in the context of the next 2 years will be very restrictive. We may no longer be able to use the term green building for what we have in Poland, because such buildings don't exist and won't for a long time. Sustainable buildings don't exist and won't exist for a long time either, because we only have buildings that do a little less harm. We can discuss green building certification, which are valuable tools, but they only slightly reduce our carbon footprint and the negative impact of buildings. So what can we do? Returning to the question, there are many aspects. We should focus on reducing this negative impact. Firstly, construction materials. We need to consider their production, their incorporation into the building, and their recovery. Above all, we should use fewer resources. For example, in recent years, the trend has been to avoid suspended ceilings in many locations. There used to be a reason for them to cover installations, provide acoustic benefits, diffuse lights, and improve ventilation. But where we can eliminate them, why not? The goal is to reduce the number of materials used. For instance, the extensive use of plasterboard can lead to significant waste on construction sites. About 25% of plasterboard often ends up in landfills as offcuts that we don't use. Sometimes recycling occurs and aluminium components are fortunately a valuable resource, so they are reused. This is one aspect. Building materials are a broad topic. Energy efficiency, as we've already discussed, is another important factor. Water efficiency related to the building is also crucial. Additionally, it's important to consider how the building functions and what emissions it produces. For example, with a pellet stove or even a gas stove, there are emissions from the building, so reducing these emissions is key, and renewable energy sources play a part in that. However, photovoltaic panels also become waste after 15 to 20 years. Batteries and energy storage are significant challenges as well. We need to figure out what to do with them in the future. We will need to address the life cycle of these panels several times. Even with geothermal systems, we need energy to operate the compressors. These are complex and interrelated issues. The management of buildings, both existing and new, is crucial. Often, a building designed with high energy saving parameters ends up consuming twice as much energy once operational. Adjusting a complex building like a shopping center to meet its design parameters can take 1 or 2 years. Effective management involves not only saving electricity and water, but also managing costs. Rising energy prices in Europe are pushing us to focus more on energy savings, so the financial aspect is becoming more prominent than the environmental aspect. The building's life cycle is also important. When we dismantle buildings, we deal with hazardous materials like asbestos, mercury, lead, and tar paper, which end up polluting the environment. These materials accumulate in the soil, and we're not just talking about emissions into the air and greenhouse gases, we are also polluting the soil and water. Construction has many environmental impacts. Last week, I attended an international architects meeting in Paris where architects from India participated. There was an extensive and interesting discussion on sustainability, including the end-of-life cycle of buildings. As I mentioned, we have many existing buildings that need repair and renovation. However, there are some buildings where it may not be worthwhile, both financially and environmentally. I'm not fond of the term repair in this context. In their country, due to its relatively poor economic status, the issue of building materials ending up in dumps or causing pollution at the end of a building's life cycle is less of a problem. Of course, India does not have significant pollution issues, but when a building is demolished there, people come to dismantle it. In slums, this demolition provides a source of secondary materials for a society that is much poorer than ours.
Które po prostu potrzebuje wszystkiego z tego budynku, żeby odzyskać i użyć wtórnie.
The level of utilization is likely much higher there than it is in our country, right? Exactly. In discussions with Indian architects, I realized that despite their modern and increasingly ecological designs, their poor society often leads to more sustainable practices. In contrast, in wealthier societies, like in the
Przez to, że
European
doszliśmy
Union, we've
do,
become less
pewnego
ecological.
poziomu komfortu. Tutaj myślę o Unii Europejskiej. Tak?
We
Takiej
often
bogatej wspólnoty,
prioritize
jak to się mówi.
comfort and economic value over
Staliśmy się
sustainability,
bardzo brudnym
resulting in
społeczeństwem,
practices
bardzo
like
nieekologicznym
demolishing
społeczeństwem,
20-year-old
tak? Bo
office
wstrzymamy
buildings
na
in
pieniądze,
Warsaw City
bo
Centre.
oczekujemy komfortu. Dlaczego właśnie wyburzamy budynki 20-letnie, biurowce w Warszawie?
Is it because the buildings are
centrum?
technically
Czy dlatego, że
outdated?
to już jest
That's
śmierć
not
techniczna? I
necessarily
nieprawda.
true. Perhaps
Może
installations
instalacje
could be
mogliśmy
replaced
wymienić,
or facades improved or
elewacje,
repaired.
tak, poprawić, naprawić albo wymienić.
It's
Tylko
often
dlatego,
because
że już
these
nie spełnia
buildings
naszych
no longer
oczekiwań,
meet our comfort
komfortu,
expectations, such as
mieszkańców.
having low
Bo mamy za
ceilings,
niskie
insufficient
stropy, bo
space.
no wiele
Many
tam
factors
aspektów, które
shouldn't
tak
necessarily
naprawdę nie
dictate
powinny
demolition.
decydować o
We
tym,
need to
że
reconsider
wyburzamy,
and
bo
make
po
wiser
prostu
choices.
chcemy pójść wyżej, tak? Więcej powierzchni użytkowej.
As architects
Także
and producers
no
of
dużo
building
niemądrych rzeczy
materials, we
robimy
need to
z
be
tymi
aware of
budynkami,
these
i my
issues
musimy
and
to
present
zrobić.
arguments to
Musimy
investors
mieć
showing that
świadomość, architekci
environmentally
pod
responsible
część rodzaju
choices can also be
budowlanych.
financially
Przede
beneficial.
wszystkim mieć argumenty, żeby
We
przekonać
need to
inwestora
integrate these considerations
do tego, że
effectively.
jemu też się będzie to opłacało. Nie tylko być jako odpowiedzialny ekologicznie, ale przede wszystkim finansowo. Tak, tak to wszystko powiązać, żeby działało.
Właśnie to jest wszystko tak powiązane, jest tyle
Everything is so interconnected with numerous variables and factors to consider. Someone listening to this might think it's pointless if they can't create a fully sustainable building due to the complexity of the supply chain.
Nie jestem w stanie aż tak głęboko pójść w łańcuch dostaw, aż tak perspektywicznie o tym wszystkim myśleć, żeby wziąć wszystko pod uwagę.
This impatience reflects our society's desire for simple, zero-sum solutions. Aha, we are harmful and we don't want to be harmful. So, if we want to be harmless, does that mean we should stop designing, building and using buildings? Should we start living in the forest? But as I mentioned, everyone wants to be comfortable, including in India. They don't want to live in slums. They want a standard of comfort similar to what we have in the wealthy north, the European Union. We are indeed a rich and comfortable society compared to countries like India or much of the world. We enjoy tremendous comfort. As this comfort increases, we come back to the issue of converting our environmental footprint or even our per capita carbon footprint. In Poland, it's about 8 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per capita per year, and unfortunately this is rising. Although we as Poles aren't increasing our footprint, it is growing, as it were. 20 years ago, it was about half as much. Why? Because we now have household appliances that we didn't have 20 or 30 years ago, like computers, cell phones and iPads, even though they are becoming more energy efficient. We charge everything, after all. Yes, which we plug in. I once spoke with a physics professor who pointed out that while 30 years ago a refrigerator used a lot of energy, now a cell phone uses a similar amount of energy. I said, that's impossible, I only charge mine for a couple of hours each day. He explained that it's not just the device itself, but also the energy used by satellites and broadcast stations. The overall energy required to operate these devices adds up to a significant carbon and environmental footprint. I look at it like this. I have 4 people at home and a refrigerator, and now I have 5 devices that need energy plus the computer. Yes, this carbon footprint increases with every citizen because we want to live in a certain level of comfort. We keep coming back to that. We can't forbid countries like India and China from aspiring to the same comfort as the wealthy North.
żyć w takim komforcie jak my, bogata północ.
Contrary to
która właśnie
appearances, the
wbrew
United
pozorom,
States has the
Stany
largest
Zjednoczone,
per capita
tam
carbon
świat węglowy na
footprint.
obywatela mają największy.
Tak,
Prosperity
to powoduje, że
often
nie
leads
szanujemy
us to
zasobów w ogóle.
waste resources.
Jako prezes SART miałem
As
okazję
president
współpracować
of
z różnymi
SARP,
pokoleniami architektów.
You've
No,
worked
tutaj
with
jest pytanie
different
takie,
generations of
czy
architects.
Tak, nie wiem, nadchodząca
So,
generacja
is there hope
Z
in the
to jest
young
taka
generation,
nadzieja, bo
Generation
oni,
Z, who
jak
think
wiadomo,
and see
inaczej
the
już
world
myślą,
differently?
inaczej widzą ten świat? Czy w nich jest nadzieja, że będą inaczej projektować, inaczej podchodzić do tematu?
Generation Z
Pokolenie Z, czyli tam
includes those born from
1997
1997
urodzeni na
to
2012.
2012.
Pokolenie moich dzieci tak naprawdę. Ja jestem
This
jakimś
is actually my
przedstawicielem
children's
pokolenia
generation.
X,
I am from
zupełnie
Generation
innych czasach,
X,
czasach,
which
kiedy gdzieś tam
experienced different
początek życia
times,
to stan
starting with the
wojenny,
martial
gdzieś
law.
pamiętamy, jak było ciężko, ale wbrew pozorom mieliśmy
Despite
tylko
the
lepiej,
challenges,
tak? Cały czas tylko
things
lepiej.
kept
A
improving for
pokolenie
us.
Z to
Generation
są
Z, on
dzieci
the other hand,
urodzone,
grew
wychowane
up
w
during a
innych
time of
czasach. To
prosperity,
właśnie
surrounded
dobrobytu.
by iPhones and with
Czasach,
unprecedented access to knowledge.
iPhone'ów, czasach takiej otwartości na wiedzę przede
While
wszystkim,
having
tak?
iPhones
Oczywiście
has
to
its
powiedzmy, że
downsides,
mamy iPhony,
it
ma
also
minusy,
brings
tak,
significant
ale ma dużo
advantages.
ogromnych
This
plusów.
generation is open
To
to
jest
innovation,
społeczeństwo
more
otwarte
tolerant
na
and thinks
innowacje,
globally.
bardziej tolerancyjne, też myślące globalnie.
We
Tak?
grew up with
Urodziliśmy w czasach,
borders
kiedy
and
to Polska
limitations,
granice,
both
paszport,
physical
w ogóle
and
nie
mental.
wyjeżdżaliśmy, tak? I
wizy i tak
fizycznie,
dalej,
i
tak.
For
mentalnie
us,
też.
accessing knowledge
dostęp
meant
wiedzy,
going to the
chociażby
library.
w bibliotece.
For my
Dla moich
children,
dzieci jest
it's
niepojęte, tak? Bo
instantaneous
od
through
małego, jak
Google.
zadawali jakieś trudne pytania, powiedziałam, nie wiem, ale zaraz ci powiem.
When they
Bo
have
Google
difficult
sprawdzam, tak?
questions, I can quickly find answers
Jakieś tam
online.
najgłębsze miejsce na ziemi,
This is
inne rzeczy.
something
I
that
pytanie mojego
wasn't
syna,
possible for us unless we
miało
found it in an
odpowiedź. Nikt nie
encyclopedia.
potrafił odpowiedzieć, no chyba, że tam
So you could say
encyklopedię
Generation
się
Z
dało
is
znaleźć
more
odpowiedź na to
educated, more
pytanie.
aware, and
Więc
open
można
to
powiedzieć, że
innovation.
wyedukowane,
They
bardziej-
also have a
bardziej
different
świadome.
approach to
To
work.
pokolenie Z jest otwarte na innowacje.
While we might seek
Też,
stability
troszeczkę
and
inny
a
ma
comfort
typ
zone,
pracy, bo my jak mamy jakąś
they
pracę,
focus
tak,
on
wiem,
the present
stabilność,
and are
strefę
eager to drive
komfortu, to
change.
sobie w niej jesteśmy. A tu oni bardziej myślą o tym, jestem tu i teraz, ale
They
chcę
might
zmieniać,
take a
bo chcę
year
sobie
to
robić,
learn
czegoś się
something in one
nauczę,
place,
potem
then
tam
move on or explore
pojadę,
other
czegoś
interests.
innego sprawdzę i dobrze.
And that's a
Dzięki
positive
Bogu,
change.
że
We, on
tak
the other
jest,
hand, tend to be more
ponieważ,
conservative
no,
while
my
the world
jesteśmy
is
trochę
rapidly evolving.
konserwatywni,
We are starting
a
to
świat się
realize how
zmienia.
much we've messed up
Zdajemy
and it
zaczynamy
needs to be
zdać sobie sprawę,
fixed.
jak bardzo go popsuliśmy, a tu trzeba go naprawiać. I to jest nadzieja właśnie
There
w
is
tym
hope
pokoleniu
in
Z,
Generation Z,
które jest
who are
otwarte
open to
na
innovation,
innowacje, które jest
exploration,
otwarte
travel,
na
and tolerance.
poszukiwanie, na podróże, na tolerancję pewnych rzeczy.
I see this as a positive development.
I, no, dla mnie to jest plus. Tak,
We
że
should
oni
try to
myślą.
adopt some of the
I
thinking of
też
Generation Z,
powinniśmy
even
coś
though
takiego
Generation
zrobić.
X is generally more
Z?
conservative.
Znaczy, przepraszam, tak, jak pokolenie Z.
I've heard
Mimo, że
people my
żeńscy, no,
age
gdzieś
dismiss
tam wiadomo,
global
że
warming and
bardziej
other changes,
konserwatywni
thinking these
jesteśmy,
issues will only
bo
become severe in 50
też
years,
słyszałam osoby w moim
long
wieku,
after
tak,
they
że
are gone.
dobra, globalne ocieplenie, zmiany, ale słuchaj, to będzie
This
za
perspective
50
is
lat,
troubling.
katastrofy, jakieś
People
takie
who
straszne
don't have
wojny, nic
children
nie będzie na
might
świecie.
think only about the
przeraziło.
present, and
Tak?
this is
Kto nie ma
sad.
dzieci, nie myśli, jest tu i teraz. Tak?
It's important to
To
think
jest
about the
słuszne.
future
Tak
and
nie
what we will
powinniśmy
leave
myśleć.
behind.
Powinniśmy tym bardziej
Currently,
myśleć, co my
we are
pozostawiamy.
leaving behind
Na
a
razie
climate
tą
catastrophe.
katastrofę klimatyczną
So,
pozostawiamy.
what can we do
Co jeszcze
now,
możemy
today,
zrobić tu i teraz,
tomorrow,
dzisiaj,
next month, to
jutro, za
mitigate
miesiąc,
the disaster and
żeby
prepare for
ta
the inevitable
katastrofa,
changes?
no, nie była tak
These
dotkliwa,
changes
tak?
are
Byli
already
gotowi na
happening
te zmiany,
and
bo one
will accelerate.
następują, będą
We
przyspieszać.
need to teach future
Więc
generations how to
nauczmy
navigate these
pokolenie, które
challenges safely,
pozostanie po nas,
ensuring their
żeby
future is secure.
potrafiło bezpiecznie
Their future
odnaleźć,
will
żeby to
undoubtedly
było
be
bezpieczne, bo
different
ona na pewno
and
będzie
will
inna.
change,
Ona się będzie
but
zmieniać,
let's aim to make
ale
it
żeby było
safe.
No i
Well,
tego się w
let's
takim razie
stick to that
trzymajmy.
then.
Agnieszko, bardzo Ci
Thank you,
dziękuję za
Agnieszka,
tę
for
rozmowę,
this
a ja już
conversation.
zapraszam na
I'm looking forward
kolejne
to more
wywiady
interviews
na
on the
temat
future of
przyszłości
design, architecture, and
architektury,
construction.
budownictwa, które już
Thank you
wkrótce.
again.
Bardzo dziękuję.